Thank you for joining us this evening. The WPS Steering Committee is proud to present our Enrichment Series webinar featuring Janet Bickel, Leadership and Career Development Coach. Ms. Bickel is a nationally recognized expert in faculty, career, and leadership development with 40 years of experience in academic medicine and science. She'll be speaking to us this evening about power, sex, and advancement. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you, Julie. So tonight we'll be speaking about power and advancement through a gender-related lens. As we all appreciate, gender is a very powerful social category. It's often the first thing we notice about someone, and yet we have to watch making generalizations based on gender because each person's experience of it and its interrelationships with age, with ethnicity, and with other situational variables unique to each person is such that each person's experience of gender is to some extent unique. Yet in order to talk about this important subject, we have to make some generalizations, and the generalizations that I'll be making tonight are well supported in the literature. And on the materials for tonight's call, you'll notice those 3 articles, and I'll be referring to these and to a few other resources as we go along. So the goals for tonight are to help equip you to discuss gender-related stereotypes in order to bridge differences, to establish dialogue, and to respond intelligently to pressures that most women still experience to mute their ambition. And then if we have time, hopefully also to talk about mentoring male colleagues to get better at recognizing the negative impact of bias and to overcome them. So this is the picture that is still so familiar. In fact, in the Harvard Business Review, which I hope many of you look at, in the November issue, there's a profile of the 100 top world CEOs, and only 2 of them are women. And certainly we don't all want to be CEOs. That's not what this is about. The reason why we continue to talk about this subject of the influence on gender in organizations and career and leadership development is because each of you has enormous potential, and we want everyone to achieve their potential and have the kind of power and influence that is uniquely aligned to your strengths and values. And so we need to look at what might be getting in the way of that and what you can do about it. Now, this is kind of a cynical look at perhaps why we are where we are yet in terms of women's having so many, it feels as if, responsibilities. We won't be talking about those. We will be talking instead about these cumulative career disadvantages that most women continue to experience. And these are very interconnected, as you can appreciate. To some extent, all women still experience the psychological legacy of previous eras in which, in order to survive, women had to be acceptable to more powerful others. And even though, well, we live in a half-changed world now, even though women don't have to prove that level of acceptability, and even though women have equal access to education, which wasn't true even a few generations ago, there still are this psychological legacy to some extent. We still have to bend our personalities to fit situations in ways that men do not have to. So it's important to understand the gender-related dynamics that we continue to face in order to work effectively with them and to develop the skills that we need. Now, some of you, I hope many of you have had a look at this book that made quite a sensation last year by Sheryl Sandberg. And one of the, even though it's controversial in many ways, one of its values, I think, is that it is readable by men. And it also gives a good overview of a lot of the emerging insights over the past few years. And I meant to say up front that I won't have time to comment on each of the comments in my slides. We will be allowing at least 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions. And so anything that I don't discuss that's on the slides that you would like to hear more about, I hope you'll save that, write that down. So the tiara syndromes, many of you may not have heard that term before, but I think it's a useful one in understanding why, from the very week that young men and women leave their educational program into the real world, women start falling behind immediately with regard to salary. And it's probably because more women than men, girls and boys, believe that if they just work really hard and they're loyal and committed, that they will be rewarded. Their work will be recognized. And as we appreciate in the business world, you get what you negotiate, not so much what you deserve. And I think it's helpful for all of us to be alert to this syndrome because it continues to be active. And so that today's women medical students, even though they certainly have advantages, still are falling behind in part because of this type of orientation, illusion and orientation. Another important point that Sandberg discusses is research that shows that women tend to only apply for jobs if they meet all of the criteria. So helping each other and gaining the self-confidence to believe that you can learn as you go versus that you're not ready for a new job or a promotion unless you meet all the criteria. So part of what we want to really focus on tonight is what interferes with both men and women accurately evaluating women's skills, since we have abundant evidence that as medical students and residents, women perform, sometimes outperform their male colleagues, and yet in the more qualitative areas, and once they leave the educational program, the evaluation of women's skills loses some ground. And I think these are some key points here that in general, Western and Eastern culture too remains conflicted about how much authority to actually allow women. And there's also a lot of evidence with regard to CEO searches that show that CEOs tend to be above 6 feet tall. They tend, and white male, of course, they tend to have lustrous hair or are bald. They have deep, resonant voices. So what if you're not born in that magic genetic circle? Well, that's why we're talking about this tonight. And calling this bias doesn't get us very far because everybody believes that they're fair. So I have found that the work of Daniel Kahneman and other scientists in helping us understand that cognitive shortcuts are built into the brain, and finding non-judgmental ways to talk about these kind of shortcuts can be helpful in bridging our beginning discussions with our colleagues about how to overcome them. Unfortunately, most search committees, most promotion committees occur under conditions where the evaluators are under a lot of time pressure, there's a lot of distractions, they lack specific decision criteria, making criteria, and that's when bias is most likely to pop up. And so how can we appeal to selectors and to our male colleagues to become more willing to look at these kinds of bias that may be interfering with their accurate evaluation of women's strengths and skills? well, appealing to their desire to become more objective. And that's one of the reasons why I titled that article, which is the second one in your materials tonight, on how men can excel as mentors of women. Because most physicians, I find, they want to excel, and appealing to that need to be objective. We want the best candidates, right? Then we better be able to evaluate them accurately. And this is an example of what often gets in the way, is that men and women's strong behaviors are evaluated differently, such that women are allowed a much narrower band of assertive behaviors. We have to be adequately aggressive, assertive in order to meet our goals, and yet women risk being misinterpreted. They risk making men uncomfortable, and when that happens, it's very difficult to put the discussion or the evaluation back on track. And to make matters worse, as many of you also have probably experienced, we expect women to be better at this than men, and oftentimes they aren't. Not only that, women tend to hold each other to higher standards of likability and relational skills and nurturing and affability than they hold their male colleagues to. We don't really have time to get into this aspect of it. I've written this article about it. It's the third one in your materials tonight, and if any of you would like to discuss this during our discussion period, please feel free to raise the issue. So this comic about Miss Trigg trying to get respect and some credit for her ideas, most women I know have had this experience of, and men have it too, but women tend to be less visible and to have to work even harder to get credit for their ideas. And this can pose a difficult dilemma, how to raise this issue of not getting credit, because sometimes it is important, and it's being able to discern when you can raise it and how, when it's not a battle that you're likely to win ultimately. It can help a lot to have allies in a situation like this. If there's a pattern in a group or a committee, a board that you're on, in which women are not getting credit for their ideas compared to men, having a discussion with the chairperson about practices that enable the best of everyone to come to fruition, having an ally or a colleague raise, like, or refer to, didn't Ella just raise that a few minutes ago? Those kind of approaches can help. And or recognizing that perhaps the style with which you are raising issues is not the most effective, and really working on that. And so here's a few other typical kind of situations that occur, are good examples of difficult situations that I've seen many iterations of, that it might be worthwhile to pause on for a second. In fact, the October issue of the Harvard Business Review, there's a really good case study entitled, "Should a Female Director Tone It Down?" And one of the aspects of the case was, in fact, this, that another member of the board said to the director, "You remind me of my teenage daughter," and how to respond to that. And the person in the case study did not respond to that. She let it go. And the recommendation is that we not allow those kind of devaluing comments to go. You'll have to decide whether to address it in the actual meeting in which it occurs, or whether that might backfire and it's better to do it one-on-one. But you might ask the person who said that, say more about that. What do you mean? I'm curious as to what on earth you could be implying by that. And try to have a dialogue in which you keep the tone light, not shaming, but really try to turn it into a learning conversation if possible. Because the person, sometimes, as we know, sometimes men make comments about this not on purpose to be devaluing, but sometimes that is the point. But sometimes because they can't think of anything else to say, or they feel awkward, or they want to distract from what's really going on, or something like that. But being able to handle these kind of comments with a light touch and yet an educational one is a skill that takes practice. The second example that one of my colleagues actually brought to me is that she said, compared to guys I compete with, my style seems deferential, but when I interviewed for a chief position, a search committee member told me that I come across as too self-confident. What's the truth? Well, we are talking about perceptions here, and it can be helpful to remember that. It's been called the pink microscope, going back to that narrower band of assertive behavior that women have are allowed. It's not so much the reality of is it this or is it that, it's what is perceived. And recognizing that when we get feedback like that, it may be telling us more about the feedback giver than it is an objective evaluation of our strong behavior. At the same time as we become willing to look at if that behavior is striking someone as too self-confident, maybe I should become curious about that and try to get other feedback to see if that's an outlier, or to see if there's another aspect of my style that may be interfering with my being as effective as I'd like to be. And then the third one, which also happened to a client of mine recently, a very well-respected, well-grounded surgeon and an anesthesiologist who she considered a friend, said to her, I need to tell you that you're not well-liked. And it felt devastating to her. She works on relationships. She has a lot of evidence that she's good at it, good at relationships. And again, the recommendation is to try to explore that, to ask for more information, to think about what they're using as a database, and to try to talk to other people. And these kind of generalized feedback, especially for women, especially on a style issue, isn't very helpful, again, because of the higher standards that women are held to with regard to likability, and appreciating that also people tend to be uncomfortable in giving feedback. And yet we need to try to drill down and get information about how we come across. And one really helpful book that I recommend by one of the best business writers, whose name is Marshall Goldsmith, his book on What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And it's not written for women. In fact, there weren't very many women in his database. I asked him. But Goldsmith's observation is that almost all of us have an interpersonal behavior that we either need to stop doing, or some style or communication skill that we need to get better at. And the only way we can really do that is by getting feedback. And we'll be talking a bit about that later. So addressing these these kind of communication skills that women really have to be better at than men, as I think you appreciate for all the reasons we just talked about. This is a very shorthand description of them. And they're key to negotiation, to conflict management, to delegation, to giving and getting feedback. And it all starts with self-monitoring, which is the core of emotional intelligence. That is the effective use of emotions in relationships. And we're all pretty good at this when things are going our way, but we really learn about how emotionally intelligent we are when someone says something that challenges us or devalues us, when we feel devalued. And our first response often is self-protective and defensive. And once that defensiveness engages, often we're not going to be at our best. We're going to stop listening. Many of us will stop breathing deeply, less oxygen to the brain. We'll lose access to our creativity and sense of humor and experience. And so right there at that first bit of physical evidence that you might be getting that a negative emotion has been engaged, ask yourself, really try to pause as soon as you get any evidence at all, and just ask yourself, what hooked me? What am I reacting to? And then accept responsibility for it. Certainly ask yourself, how can I keep this negative emotion from interfering with what I want to happen right now in this conversation or this meeting or this relationship? And so often, if we can move into an inquiry and a listening mode, we can continue to access our best selves rather than get distracted by our defenses. And so being able to ask then, can you tell me more about what you mean, or asking for examples, and remaining curious, and then listening in a generative way, which we'll talk about in a moment. So relational communication skills is not just telling, not just advocacy, which is often what we think of when we think about communication skills. It's also the self-monitoring and the inquiry and the listening. And when we do advocate, when we are putting a position on the table or need to share what we consider to be facts, it's helpful to give a bit more background than we often do. Explain why you're raising this and how you arrived at your conclusions. Sometimes just a little bit more background and a little bit more skill in any of these areas can have really positive results. So this is what we mean by generative listening versus the kind of automatic listening that most of us engage in. And knowing when it's important to listen really generatively, when the discussion is important. We tend to listen automatically when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're distracted, and so really knowing when you need to slow down enough to listen generatively. And with regard to receiving positive feedback, I hope some of you saw a recent article in the New York Times that was a good discussion of studies showing how much more often women compared to men receive negative feedback, and then how very much of it is personal. Just as we were speaking of before, telling women that they're not well liked, for instance, and that really strong women tend to receive the most inappropriate criticism. And I think it's helpful to remind ourselves, if you've experienced this, that any important work is going to draw criticism. And so being able to develop a way of receiving feedback and hearing what we would interpret negatively or that feels devaluing, being able to interpret it in a way that leads to learning on our part and that doesn't damage the relationship is a really important skill. And similarly, with regard to becoming more fluent with conflict, and as you appreciate, the more complex your work, the more competitive the environment, which is true for virtually all professionals now, the more conflict there will be. And conflict is actually natural. The more diversity there is and the more competition, it's completely natural. And so becoming more comfortable with it and becoming more versatile in your approach to it is really critical. And these are some of the recommendations along those lines in preparing for the kind of conflicts that often arise, learning from our experience this way. And similarly, as any of you know who've read this very useful book by Linda Babcock, and as probably most of your experience has led you to appreciate that women don't do as well in negotiating as men do. First of all, we tend not to recognize when negotiation is taking place. We don't prepare for it. And then when we do initiate negotiations, women tend to be pushed back harder, have fewer degrees of ways to use leverage, because in order to build social capital, to have influence, we need to be likable, and assertive women are considered less likable. And so the extra work then in preparing for a negotiation is absolutely necessary in order to find that fine balance between strength and likability. And so important to know what your goals are in an exchange, in a relationship, in a negotiation. And that means knowing what success means to you right now and appreciating how that might be changing and staying focused on that. And then seeking common ground in relationships. And sometimes it's helpful to remind others about the shared commitments, what we both stand to achieve if we can reach an agreement. And often women find it easier to negotiate if they're negotiating on behalf of a team or someone else in addition or instead of themselves. And so starting from that team-based view can be helpful also, and also perceived as more socially acceptable in addition to being more comfortable to you. And even in rough situations, even when you may have a lot of good reasons to feel righteously indignant, to be resentful, to really try to cultivate constructive emotions. And it can help if we're able to remain curious about why people are behaving the way they are and how you might have the kind of impact that you want to have. And then versatility, when to tone up or dial up your strengths and when to dial them down. For instance, if you tend to be very extroverted or very intense, knowing when, depending on your goals in a situation, you need to dial it down, the intensity down, or the opposite of that. If you tend to have a rather quiet presence and you need to be heard, you need to be seen as a leader, you may have to dial up your energy. The thing is, each situation, each conflict, each negotiation is to some extent unique. And so being able to no one is a chameleon, but being able to have a versatile enough style that you can tailor it to some extent, depending upon the challenges of the situation. And for women, also recognizing that you can't please everyone. that it may keep you awake at night, that you know that you are not liked by someone or have been misunderstood, and they've actually found our amygdalas operate slightly differently than men's do. So it's not surprising we have these negative emotions, these repetitive ruminations that keep us awake at night. To some extent, there's actually a biological understanding of that. But accepting that probably our standards for ourselves are too high, and that there are ways of being both polite and firm, of being able to be in charge without being interpreted as too big for our britches, and experimenting with what combination works best in different situations. Certainly one style does not fit all, although many men do tend to be able to get away with that. So I'm suggesting that it's really important for women to be able to assess yourself. And these are some of the key questions that arise for professionals who want to become even more effective in their organization. So I would invite you to assess yourself along these lines. And particularly the understanding your organization. What does organizational savvy look like? Here are some recommendations along those lines. As we were suggesting, building your capacity for competition and complexity, not only with regard to your clinical and scientific skills, but with regard to these other kinds of skills that we've been talking about, the communication skills, negotiation skills, and getting better at asking questions in a way that is not so likely to be misinterpreted as either too weak or lacking in confidence, or too brassy. Again, though, recognizing that these are all matters of perception, but constructively, carefully asking questions so that we can really learn more about what we need to know about how our organizations operate. And studying how people interpret their roles and responsibilities can often give us insight into why they're doing or saying what they're doing, and it can also keep us from prematurely labeling people as untrustworthy or controlling or micromanaging. For instance, someone who micromanages probably is interpreting their role in a different way than you might if you prefer more autonomy, and that can help give insight too. And then differentiating between what you can and cannot influence is so critical for your own resilience and sanity. And as you discern what you can't influence and what you need to simply accept about the system that you're working in or the person that you need to be able to relate to, that can help you become even more analytic and skilled at influencing what actually you can influence. So this is about contextual IQ, and you learn more about that from Harvard Business Review too. That kind of adaptability to and noticing the context and the trends can be so important in being effective. So one of the other topics that I'm glad that we'll have time to get to, that I wish that I had gotten better at much earlier, is raising the subject with my male colleagues about how they can get better at recognizing when gender bias is interfering and to indeed excel as mentors of women, since most men have better track records in mentoring men, and then because they, it's for many reasons, then they haven't gotten better at actually mentoring women. And so these are some of the points that I think are helpful to take into consideration. And this is the second of the articles that are in the material. And here are some additional recommendations. And so to some extent, in summary here, and this is the last slide I put together, we all want to become as resilient as possible, right? Resilience is being able to remain robust even in the face of great challenges and stresses over the long run. And this is dependent upon a high level of self-knowledge and self-awareness, the ability to remain free from arrogance and nostalgia, the kind of nostalgia that indulges in the wish that things would slow down or become less complex, or that we have had already solved all these kind of gender-related issues that many of us thought were indeed going to become much easier to overcome than they have turned out to be. And then experimenting with alternatives, continuing to invent options and scan the landscape and trends, and recognize that there will indeed be setbacks and that those are a natural part of development. So the question is continuously then, how can we learn from our surprises and our failures? And in order to be able to continuously learn in this way, we need a community of trusted colleagues. And I would imagine that for most, if not all of you, your participation in this association of the plastic surgeons women has greatly aided your abilities to make sense of what's going on, to learn about opportunities to get connected to inspiring role models, and this kind of participation that you're engaged in right now is so important. And then for women, as you appreciate the burnout rate for women physicians is greater than for men, the suicide rate is greater. There really are greater risks. And so undertaking a commitment to your own physical, mental, and emotional health is so critical for so many reasons. And the first thing that usually goes, the women physicians that I've known over the last 40 years, the thousands, the first thing that goes is the time that you have for yourself. And it actually is so important to set aside time in order to continue to rejuvenate and to renew. And it's really in slowing down, finding ways and times that you can actually slow down, that you access your own wisdom, and that you're able to reflect on your own experience in constructive ways that allow you to see new ways forward and to gain the energy required to keep growing. So, Julie, I guess I'm ready to open it up for questions now.
The conference has been unmuted.
Dr. Bickel, I'd like to point out in the bottom corner of the screen there's a question there. Did you see that as well, or shall I read it?
I'm just seeing a question here. Okay. So the question is, how do you suggest a young-looking female surgeon should handle the fact that everyone assumes that she is a nurse or a visitor, even when she's wearing her physician ID? Example, getting kicked out of the recovery room when you were trying to see the patient you just operated on. Yes, this is a common occurrence, especially among young-looking women, and especially attractive ones, I would say. And so, number one, I guess, is appreciating that when people don't recognize that you are a physician, that it's not to take it personally, that it's their lens that's preventing them from seeing you. And so then to very, as respectfully and, again, with a sense of humor to the extent that you can, of just reminding the person that I'm the physician here, and what your role is in the most even-handed way that you can, and trying not to be surprised or angry about it. And I guess the only other observation on that is there any way that you might be able to change your appearance that would signal to people your level of that you're a physician? There may not be, but sometimes there is. And that's the kind of thing one can seek feedback on from a colleague. Next question, please. So the next question that's arriving seems not to have arrived.
And just to remind everyone, all the calls are unmuted right now, so you can just go ahead and speak your question as well.
Okay, well, I have a question. I was typing it, but I have a question. The slide on, being criticized, you're like my teenage daughter, or those types of comments. I'm all for open communication and responding with kindness, but I just wonder how much of that just invites more criticism. Like if somebody says something to you, especially in a public place, and and you say, "Oh, tell me more about that," then all of a sudden it becomes kind of open season. Well, people don't like you for these reasons, and the concern that I would have is, how do you already saying those things? You're like my teenage daughter, or you're not well liked. Already, those are boundary violations, and so how do you not close off but maintain your boundaries with really, it's in the work environment, I really don't care whether he thinks that I'm like his teenage daughter or not, and it's really not relevant.
And so I certainly appreciate the question, and it indicates how difficult these kind of discernments are, and that to some extent each stimulus and each situation is different. So there's no generalization that it's that in the moment often assessment of whether, do I need to handle this right now? Do I need to push back or try to educate or ask a question that will help this person recognize how completely out of bounds what they just said was? And can I do it in a way that won't humiliate this person in front of their colleagues? Or do I really need to come on strong so that everybody gets it? So I appreciate that each discernment is to some extent a new one. And I agree. If there's a possibility of it becoming open season and more boundary violations pile on, then it's not worth the risk. So other comments or other questions along those lines, or Deborah, do you have additional observations?
My name is Kathy Meyer, and I might suggest that there are ways to kind of turn that back and say, oh, but I hope my behavior is different than your teenage daughter as well as my training.
That's,
and so you can acknowledge that he said that, but you can also differentiate yourself from that.
Oh, that's good. That's the kind of thing that I would come up with 4 days later.
Well, and sometimes.
But
go ahead.
I was just thinking, for some of these things, it's for some of these things, it's nice to kind of have these common scenarios so that we can maybe help young women and or all women with even sort of scripts that you can turn to that will help you in some of these things, because there are similarities in the ways that women are put down.
Yeah, I haven't found. I mean, since each situation is to some extent different, and you know yourself the kind of situation that you've come, in contact with, and then you develop some experience with it, and you develop an effective touch with it, like that one, Kathleen, is a good example. But each of us tends to run into different kinds of scenarios along those lines. And I think what's most important is that we find ways of not getting so defensive that it interferes with our access to our best thinking. And oftentimes, since our first response often is or to defend ourselves or to become indignant, and we recognize that we really don't have that within us in that moment, it's okay then if you don't have the great light bulb doesn't go off for a couple hours or a couple days, to circle back to that colleague. At that point,
Well, and not to interrupt, this is Peggy Skiles, and in response to the one about looking too young and being taken as a nurse, it used to happen to me way more than it does. At any rate, one of the things that I found very effective was to say, oh, I don't think we've met. I'm Dr. Skiles, and who are you? And I'm going to see my patient. And just sort of, introduce yourself. I mean, it's a perfectly neutral, socially acceptable thing to do, and usually a light bulb would go off.
Great. That's
not
really
always, but that was a good way to do that, and it's a very common situation.
Yeah, that's great. I don't believe we've met. Let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Yes. Thank you.
It works.
Thank you. That's great. Other observations or questions that any of you would like to raise? Or other types of scenarios that any of you who have occurred to you recently that might be helpful to get one of your colleagues' observations about.
Just a reminder, everyone is unmuted, so if you do have a question, feel free to speak up.
I think that just as a tip in handling a lot of these situations that can turn unpleasant, I would say that in general, humor or a sense of mischief is often a way, in surgical circles anyway, that you both command some respect and diffuse the situation to something that is a lot more social, and often, and I would say, that's very acceptable in the surgical culture.
I agree, and at the same time, though, I don't know very many people to whom that comes naturally. It's great if it does. It's really a gift. And the way that we cultivate our own sense of humor, again, is we're not going to have access to it if we're mad, probably. If we're a negative emotion is brewing, it takes a level of self-confidence and an ability to see things from other people's point of view that can enable us to bring that lightheartedness or that educational light touch. Unless any of you who are good at that, maybe tell us how you nurtured that wonderful skill.
Well, I guess I grew up with 3 brothers, and if you didn't have a silly retort to things, you didn't really exist. And so surgeons were just more brothers as I went through, and I was definitely distinctly a minority. And there were a number of situations. I remember arriving for my internship, and one of the senior handsome surgeons puts his arm around me and says, "Hi, baby." How do you respond to something like that? And having grown up with the brothers, I looked up at him and batted my eyes and said, "Hi, Tiger," right back to him. And at that point, everybody laughed.
Yeah.
And then he said, "You don't embarrass very easily." And I said, "Not that way, I guess." And so you just, yeah. So you just, and I think actually a lot of my female colleagues in surgery do have a good sense of humor, and and they're used to working under fire. And I think this is one area that we definitely can cultivate.
A wonderful book on women's use of humor is called "They Used to Call Me Snow White, But I Drifted." I hope it's still in print. It's really good, and it's Regina Barreca. One of her examples was if somebody called her honey, she said, "That's Dr. Honey to you." Things like that can be helpful. So that's great. So here's a question about how do you deal with bias towards women with children, that is, don't send referrals since we're too busy, assuming we work part-time, etc. That's really a challenging one. Perhaps the potential referrers' experience is that women with young children are less reliable or whatever, and isn't relevant, isn't valid to your situation. If you can have conversations with the colleagues about your commitment to work and what that looks like, and try to engage in a dialogue about it. Other recommendations on that bias towards women with children?
Well, this is Deborah Becker again, and it was just something that I noticed myself, which was I had to call somebody's primary care doctor when I found out that it was a female doctor, normally and I support female doctors, but I just thought, oh no, it's going to be, she's going to like work part-time. I need to get a hold of her before the OR, and she's never going to be in the office. And so, I don't, it's a real problem. It's a problem, and I realize that there's a lot of stuff on balancing, work and family, and a lot of things on, people who work part-time. But I find myself frustrated when I run into physicians who are just unavailable half the time. And I don't know.
Well, it's because the system runs on, people are expected to be there. It over-relies on what used to be considered the ideal worker, that is, people with no other responsibilities. And so many of our systems, and certainly the expectation of physicians has traditionally been that you didn't have other life. And so even though it seems kind of ridiculous at this late date, there certainly still is that expectation. And so I don't really have other observations other than to remind people of your commitment to patient care and trying to differentiate yourself from those individuals who the person may have had experience with before of not being present. And again, if we can stay non-defensive, if we can remain willing to work at creating the bridges, that can go a long way. Other observations about that, since this is such a common challenge for women, that's a systems issue. It's natural that when we want somebody there, we want somebody there, and yet everybody has a life also. Well, I don't. By way of conclusion, I just hope that some of the observations that and the review of recent literature and of the experience of so many women that I've tried to summarize tonight, that I hope it's given you perhaps some new line of sight, some way to either become an even more effective mentor and communicator yourself, or perhaps more courageous and more astute about the kind of dialogue that you can have that will help everyone achieve their potential in these competitive environments that you work in.
Thank you very much, Janet. We really appreciate you being here with us this evening.
Good. Thank you for
Thank
your help.
you so much.
Well, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.